Chapter 2 by Kevin Decker is titled, "There Are No Universal Ethical Principles That Should Govern the Conduct of Medicine and Research Worldwide." Now, I'd like to talk through his abstract because his article really has three main parts. He says, "In this chapter, I argue that while there are ethical principles that should guide medical practice and research, there are good reasons to believe that these principles are not universal." That's his main goal. So the first part of our article is about how moral principles in medicine are better understood as tools rather than standards, and we must be careful about what is historically contingent in them. The second part of his article says that the effort to find universal principles behind divergent practices seems arbitrary, since principles are essentially contested. Finally, the third part of his chapter is that the normative force of principles that seem universal has diffuse sources, meaning that they are conditioned by the prior existence of relationships between moral agents and patients. All right, Decker's introduction says we need to start with three questions. First of all, what are ethical principles? Decker wants to say we should not doubt that there are ethical principles, but we should still question whether they are universal. The second question is what would make certain ethical principles universal? Here there's three different ways you could explain what you mean by universal, and he says the third meaning of universal is the linchpin or key of the discussion in this introduction. It is normative in the sense that certain unrealized intentions, actions, or consequences should be brought about. And it's universal because it cuts across ideologies, national boundaries, cultures, and perhaps even time. Okay, so the third question he starts with is this: what is the normative force of universal principles? And he points out how principles must be able to motivate particular judgments, or else they're morally meaningless. He says that in his view, what he's going to defend in this chapter is not the form of moral relativism that leads to the consequence that it's wrong to pass judgment on others who have substantially different values, or to try to make them conform to one's values for the reason that their values are as valid as anyone's own. He's not accepting that view. He's not a moral relativist in that sense. A different kind of relativism is attractive to him, though. It's called meta-ethical relativism. And this kind of relativism accepts that moral truth and justifiability, if there are any such things, are in some way relative to factors that are culturally and historically contingent. All right, in his section on principles, one part of a balanced breakfast, Decker talks about how the key view, the difference among different views of principles is found in theories and ideas of how principles are generated in the first place. One method is more deductive, another method is more inductive, but in bioethics, what the Harvard philosopher John Rawls sees as explication of considered judgments relevant to principles typically takes one of two different forms. First, specification. Second, balancing. The idea with specification is specified principlism states that the deployment of relevant principles is to be followed by specification of how they fit the situation at hand, and ultimately what should be done. Secondly, distinct from specification is balancing. Balancing different norms assumes that there's a kind of moral weight to principles. Now, Decker quotes the pragmatist John Dewey, who continually calls our attention to how efforts to specify or to balance abstract principles leads to treating principles as standards for judgment instead of as tools for judgment. For the pragmatist, Decker tells us, the pragmatist like John Dewey, principles, along with other duties and the value of loyalty, principles represent the normative models of law and regulation. He wants to recognize, Dekker does, that principles have served a crucial role in bioethics from the very beginnings in the Hippocratic Oath. And yet, he says, the history of bioethical principles demonstrates that it's difficult to separate what is historically contingent in principles from what is universal in principles. So, he says the function and history of principles certainly suggest an important place for them in bioethics as crystallizations of practices that have, on balance, helped to preserve the right and the good in questions of health. But now, what about the status of principles as universal rules? So in his next section, Universalism, Promises and Pitfalls, Dekker considers what universalism about principles is and where it came from and what can be said in its favor and some of its problems. He points out that the first formulation of ethical universalism is found in the thought of Greek philosophers named Stoics, who argued that there was a comprehensive, binding natural law that spanned education, social status, and nationality. This view in Greek philosophy had an influence upon the Enlightenment German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And then, in the 20th century, especially after World War II, he points out how it's not that surprising that the questions of universal principles should be raised in bioethics within the first years of its germination in the mid-20th century. So he points to United Nations documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and he points out how the theory that's in that Universal Declaration is a deontological approach, which rejects nearly every other ethical theory as merely conventional, insisting that what rights people have are not just a matter of what their governments say, but are universal and should be respected as universal. So, arguments made against moral relativism, he points out, offer two good reasons to think that there are such universal principles. The first is that, quote, there are some moral rules that all societies will have in common because those rules are necessary for society to exist, unquote. That quote comes from James Rachels. The second reason for believing in universal principles, says Dekker, is that the apparent differences in practices and beliefs between cultures that might lead us to adopt moral relativism are themselves misleading. He quotes both James Rachels and another philosopher named Ruth Macklin here. Now, Dekker says that James Rachels and Ruth Macklin's attempts to find cultural commonality that would smooth over the worst intercultural moral interactions are commendable. Yet, Dekker thinks these attempts are still flawed. He gives a couple explanations of why. He says, in his case against a point against both Macklin and Rachels, if two members of very different societies do not agree in a situation upon the application of a principle, but these two people do agree that the principle applies, what do they really agree on? Dekker says that it's far better to avoid the temptation to gerrymander principles by acknowledging that the content of such rules, far from being universal, is today essentially contested. Dekker thinks we should just be as honest as we can that no matter how much we may believe a principle, it's probably not a universal principle. Now, in what is perhaps his most interesting section, Dekker titles Binding Moral Norms and Self-Evidence. Now I'm going to go to the second paragraph where Dekker says, if universal principles were self-evident, their authority would also be absolute in any case to which they validly applied. And he says universal moral principles are probably not like that. So the other way of defending universal principles is to embrace the route of proof or demonstration. If they're not self-evident, you've got to prove or demonstrate that they're real. And he says we still face a stumbling block, if we embrace the route of proof or demonstration, as to why we should acknowledge the authority of universal principles. Why should we acknowledge their authority over us? He considers two options. He says the most likely explanations for the normative force behind normative principles are two. One possibility is that this bindingness is sui generis, which means not derived from the logical self-evidence of moral rules or through proof, which can be convincing yet ignored. The second option is that the authority of principles is actually prima facie, which means it is such that we are required to consider the principle as determining a course of action in an applicable case, but other factors may, in due course, cause us to legitimately reconceive the need of acting according to the principle. So if those are our two options for where the normative force comes from, he considers the prima facie possibility first and argues against that, and then he considers if we do not want to admit prima facie principles, then the type of normative force of universal principles must differ radically from logical or empirical validity. And he considers here both evolutionary ethics and certain kinds of religious morality. In particular, when he looks at evolutionary views of ethics, Decker quotes from Richard Joyce, famous philosopher of biology, and he says, what we understand as moral in judgments, motivations, and emotions is a quality that is relational in origin. In other words, that is conditioned by the prior existence of social or ecological relationships between ourselves and other moral agents. And in his conclusion, he builds on this. He says, there is an apparent drawback of a relational approach, and that is, it asserts a connection of reason-giving force between objective relations of history and social institutions and ethical deliberation. So why is that a problem? Well, he says, as a result, the normative force of principles will be conceived as relative to these objective factors of history and social institutions, in any case when deliberation proceeds long enough. All right? He says, yet in bioethical problem solving, we can avoid charges of subjectivism at the same time as we use principles that are not universal in nature. So he doesn't think this is a disaster for bioethics. He still thinks there are principles even if they're not universal. Now, I want to just point out in closing that his discussion at the very end of his conclusion says that in bioethics and other areas of normative discourse, public moral claims that have the greatest degree of scope, encompassing particular thick commitments within wider thin principles, are very likely to achieve the greatest degree of deliberative acceptance.